So I'm going to give you a little bit of information about clinical trials, just what, the phases of clinical trials, so you can understand how these clinical trials fit into the overall drug development process. So from left to right here is shown the big picture drug development process, all the way from drug discovery and what we call preclinical work. That's the work usually in animals that shows that a drug has some effect that you want and that it's relatively safe. If all of those things look good, if we get a drug that is doing what we think it should be doing in an animal, then academic researchers or companies will go to the FDA and file what's called an IND, an investigational new drug application. And that's the point. The FDA reviews all of that data and says, okay, we think this is safe to move into a trial in humans. And then I'll go into a little bit more detail, but a drug will then go through typically 3 phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, which sort of increases in number of individuals as you go through the phases. And then at the end of that process, usually by this time it's definitely a company and not an academic institution because it's a very expensive process. The company will take all of that data and go back to the FDA with an NDA, a new drug application, and they'll say, we want this to be treating hyperphagia and PWS, just as a possible scenario. And the FDA will review all that information. They'll do what's called a benefit risk assessment. So they'll look at the benefits of the drug and the risk of the drug based on the safety profile, and they'll decide whether to approve or not. So that's this process here. And then afterwards is a continuing review of safety data out after the drug has been approved and on the market. So that's the big picture. And for our kids, we fall under a special office in the FDA called the Orphan Drug Office. And orphan drug development is based on a law that was passed, I think, in 1983. So it incentivizes companies to develop drugs for rare diseases because we're small markets. We're not cancer and heart disease. And so there are certain incentives that the FDA gives to companies, exclusivity, some tax credits, some special accelerated approvals if the drugs are working really well, if there's a very high unmet medical need. And rare diseases are defined as a disease that impacts less than 20,000 people in the US. That's the FDA's definition. PWS, we estimate there's about, just if you do the numbers, about 20,000 individuals. So I'm sorry, it's less than 200,000. So we're within the orphan drug designation. So the benefits for pharmaceutical companies for working in our population, an orphan population, and the PWS population is that we have some homogeneity. So all of our kids are experiencing hunger because of the same genetic issue. And that's not the case in the wider population with obesity or cancer. There's all different causes for that. So we have a relatively homogeneous population, which can be nice for them. We have a compelling unmet medical need. So whereas a company that's developing a diet drug for the general population, you could say, well, maybe those people should do diet and exercise more. Our kids are it's never going to be a matter of, oh, let's just teach them and do diet and exercise. We also have to completely control their environment. So that's different. For the company, it's a potential less expensive route to approval because you don't need the large numbers in an orphan indication that you do. So general obesity indications, you have to do your last clinical trial, it's usually thousands of individuals, and that wouldn't be the case in PWS. And we have a very motivated, connected, and active population. We try to educate you guys about clinical trials. We try to make sure that you're aware and that you can, that you know of the opportunities. But there are downsides to working in our population. So there's not, it's a limited population. There's intellectual disability. There's some behavioral problems. Many of our kids are already on some medications, older kids, and so that can complicate clinical trials. And we're more expensive on a per patient basis. So there's, a company has to kind of weigh those things and decide whether the PWS route is the best thing for their drug. So I'll just talk briefly about the phases of clinical trials. Most drugs go through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. So the phase 1 is what's sometimes called the first-in-human trial. It's a small trial. It's a short trial. It's just to make sure that there's no unexpected safety issues. And it can look at, like, how does the drug interact with the human body? How quickly is it cleared? Those kinds of questions. If a drug does well in a phase 1, they move to a phase 2. And again, this is not always a completely linear process, but a phase 2 maybe looks at different dosing. It's a slightly larger population. It's looking for an effect, so it tends to be a longer population. And whereas, as I said, the numbers are growing. So in a typical phase 2 for a common indication, it would be a couple of hundred people. In a rare disease, it's maybe 30, 40 people in a phase 2. The phase 3 is sometimes called the pivotal, because this is where you're trying to get the real evidence that your drug works. The FDA is looking for, is it better than what we currently have out there? Do the benefits outweigh the risks? These are larger studies for orphan indications. They, for our population, are probably on the order of about 100 individuals, a longer exposure to drug. Again, the FDA monitors for any safety issues throughout this entire process. You can see at the bottom that there is a drop-off for drugs at each phase, and so we don't expect every drug that enters phase 1 to become an approved drug. After that whole process is done, the FDA pulls all the data and reviews it all, and they do what's called a benefit risk assessment. So they look at whether the drug is safe and effective for what the company is proposing it will be used for. Do the benefits outweigh the risk? Is the labeling, how they're going to use it appropriate? And is the manufacturing process good, good enough to support the market? And this is where the patient perspective in the last probably 5 or 10 years has become more and more important. There's been laws put in place, including most recently the 21st Century Cures Act, which just passed a few months ago, that really strengthened the patient's perspective in this process. That's really important for us. I think we're, as families, are the only ones who can really understand and convey how much PWS impacts our lives, how difficult it is for the person to PWS to have an independent life, for example, if they can't control their appetite. And the FDA needs to hear that, and the FDA is very willing to hear that. And we're trying to do some things to formalize, and I'll tell you in a minute, formalize that and be able to share that with the FDA, because we want any drug that comes through PWS, if it works, we want it to help it get approval, and we need to make sure that the FDA understands the patient perspective to do that. Our challenge is the number one reason that clinical trials are delayed or not completed is due to an insufficient number of participants. So I will never tell you you should enroll in clinical trial X. That's a decision for you and your family. You need to speak to the study site doctor and understand the risks and the potential benefits of a clinical trial, mainly the risks, because these are experimental drugs. And you need to make that decision for yourself. But I will pressure you to learn about the clinical trials and take that step of calling the site if your child's eligible, and just learn about it and see if it is right for you. I'm cognizant of the fact that my son benefited from a pretty early age. We went on growth hormone at age 7, which at the time was pretty early. The only reason he was able to do that was because some other family, 20 years earlier, did a clinical trial. So it's really important for us as a community to be active where we feel like we can be active. And so we're trying to make sure we have a research-ready community. These are some of the features of what we call research-ready community. So we have a robust diagnostic test, so we know who has PWS and who doesn't, so that's great. We'd love to have a clear understanding of the biology of the disorder. We're not quite there yet, but we're working on that. We want to understand the natural history of the disorder, that is how the disorder progresses over time. And for that, we need a good patient registry, and we're gonna get after you to join the Global PWS Registry this weekend and complete all your surveys. And we want families to have a good idea of what clinical trials are. Hopefully you'll have that today. And we want to define the unmet medical needs so that the FDA understands the needs of our community and the preferences of our community. So we're doing that through the PWS Clinical Trials Consortium, which is a consortium of pharmaceutical companies, patient organizations, and academic groups, and through the registry, which again, I hope all of you will join and complete your surveys. These are the clinical trials that are ongoing for PWS, and I cannot tell you how different this is than 5 years ago, that we have this long list that I can't even barely fit on the slide. I mean, that's an amazing thing. Yeah. So the ones that we're going to hear about today are listed in bold, 3 clinical trials that are in planning stages and looking to get started very, very soon from the companies GLWL, Selena, and Alize. And I'll let them talk about that. So I'm going to say one word about some surveys that we've got for you to do. Then we're going to talk through clinical trials, and then we're going to talk about other clinical studies. If you don't want to participate or are not eligible to participate in a clinical trial, there are still ways that you can participate and advance the drug development pathway for us. And a lot of that is donating tissues or time, or tissues or time, I guess. And so we'll talk about that. So I'll talk about 2 surveys that we would love for you to complete. One is not ready yet, but you'll see coming out in social media. Lauren Schwartz-Roth and Natalie Kayajanian have been spearheading an effort to really quantify the caregiver burden. So how much does PWS impact your life, your workability, your mood? And the answer is a lot. But it's important, we all kind of know that, but it's important to quantify that because that can be used so that the FDA understands our need, the need in the community, and also it can be used to see if interventions, some of the interventions you'll hear about this weekend, like Elizabeth Ruth's social intervention, if that is relieving the burden on the entire family of PWS. So that is going to be a survey that is going to go through the global registry. We're going to link it to a measure of hyperphagia to see how much that impacts the caregiver burden. And we're going to ask you to do that at 2 different time points. And the idea is to get a baseline on everybody who's, is or is not in clinical trials so that we have sort of that natural history of what the population looks like. So that's going to come out in about a month, and we'll ask you to complete that. And then today, Sophie Say is from Johns Hopkins. Sophie's over there, yes. So Sophie is from Johns Hopkins, and she is working with the consortium to look at patient preferences. So again, we're trying to get information that can be used by the FDA in the drug approval process. And today she's piloting a survey that we're going to do nationally. So she needs about 25 or 30 individuals to fill out the survey on paper and give her some feedback about the survey. It's really looking at that question of risk-benefit, like what kind of risk would you tolerate in a drug if it benefited your child this much. And these are methods. She's from the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins. These are methods, medical economic methods that are used commonly to assess these things. So that is for individuals who have children over the age of 4. So if you have a child over the age of 4 and you'd like to help us on that, we would really appreciate it.